After decades of falling investment in public housing, it seems that governments are finally taking seriously the need to increase social housing and include low-cost accommodation in new developments. What changes are we seeing in this space, and has the rental crisis resulted in our governments learning from the mistakes of the past? Assuming new policies and funding have the desired effect, how long will it take before the crisis abates?
Welcome to The Elephant in the Room. This is the podcast where we love to talk about the big things in property that never usually get talked about. I'm Veronica Morgan, real estate agent, buyer's agent and buyer's agent mentor, co-host of Foxtel's Location Australia, author of Auction Ready and co-host of Your First Home Buyer Guide.
And I'm Chris Bates, mortgage broker, recently ranked number 5 in Australia out of over 18,000 brokers in the annual MPA Top 100 Mortgage Broker Awards. Before we get started, I need to let you know that nothing we say here can be taken as personal advice. We always recommend you engage the services of an appropriate and experienced professional.
Today, we're delighted to welcome back Michelle Adair to the podcast. Michelle is a CEO of the Wollongong-based Housing Trust, which builds and manages affordable rental housing for people on very low to moderate incomes. And they've currently got a portfolio of over 1,200 homes, another 200 in the pipeline. And in December last year, Michelle was appointed the inaugural chair of Homes Tasmania, a new statutory body tasked with delivering an additional 10,000 social and affordable homes in 10 years. Now, Michelle was previously the chair of the Community Housing Industry Association of New South Wales and is a passionate advocate in this space. Thank you so much for coming back, Michelle. There seems to be a much greater awareness now of the need for governments to participate in providing housing for low-income earners. Does this fill you with hope?
Absolutely, it does. The conversation has completely changed in the last 12 to 18 months. We've now got a very much broader cross-section of the business community, including, for example, the Business Council of Australia, and, you know, superannuation funds and conversations with our banking industry. We've got private property developers and real estate agents and construction companies and certainly as well a very broad base of recognition of need for change from all levels of government around Australia. So, yes, unfortunately, it got to the point where we had an increasing number of people experiencing homelessness and in really significant crisis before we woke up as a nation, but we are well and truly awake now, and that's the first step to finding solutions.
I guess it also kind of reminds me of the climate crisis, right? Like, unfortunately, we're not going to take action until we see it on our doorstep, right? Or we know someone who's experienced it, etc. Is it frustrate you that we've had to, you know, you've probably been banging this drum in the corner for many years, and you've seen the writing on the wall, and you can see all those issues and the things that we need to do. Does it frustrate you, or is it you more, I guess, the glass half full and think, right, well, it is what it is. Let's take action and let's pick up the pace.
I think both things, Chris, probably. My glass is always at least 3/4 full. Thank goodness, because, gosh, I don't know how I'd get out of bed some days if that wasn't the case. Yeah, look, I'm also somewhat encouraged that I'm no longer only a bleeding heart lefty. You know, that's a label I don't mind wearing with pride from time to time. But with my background and being able to very comfortably and very genuinely argue the case from a productivity, economic participation, long-term social inclusion, the reduction in health bills, the reduction in, unemployment and crisis, and increased benefits from participation in education, and you name it. As I've probably said to you before, Maslow's no longer particularly sexy in academic circles, but he's right. There's nothing in life that's possible without a safe, secure, affordable home. And here we are having very different conversations, which is great.
Do you think you're rocking up at the fight with like so much like body of work, right? Body of evidence. Like you've been having to, because you haven't been able to, get the noise, you've had to kind of go deeper on the research and get more and more evidence and build that business case, I guess. So now when they're coming to you, asking questions and wanting to be involved, you can hit them with all this and it's almost much easier to get traction.
Yeah, look, I think so. But I think to your comments earlier, It's more about the fact that every one of us knows at least somebody, or increasingly multiple numbers of people who are experiencing this crisis. And it's when a problem has personal implications, and when you see the fear and the uncertainty in your kids, in your next door neighbours. Oh gosh, what do you mean you're moving? Oh, you're selling up. Oh, what do you mean somebody's had to move in back home? Unfortunately, it's all of those really respectable, nice people with full-time, well-paying jobs that have made the reality very personal and almost legitimise it. I've done a lot of work earlier in my career in health, and it's a sad reality. You can raise money for sick kids, but when you try and raise money for sick adults, or without the emotion of a very high-profile experience, and that's, I guess that's just the way we're wired, unfortunately, as people. But we're here now. 1 in 3 Australians rent. There is, I think, a growing acceptance. All of the economists are saying the number of people that will ever own a home is continuing to decline. We're not going to turn that around. So how do we value renting? How do we change the conversation? And how do we really embrace people respectfully and value the fact that an increasing number of people are going to rent for their whole lives? It used to be, when we were kids, in the 80s and 90s, if I can be so bold as to include you in my numbers. There was an expectation, of course, that you leave home, you rent for a while, you rent when you get your first job, and then you buy. And that used to be what happens, but we know now that an increasing number of people will be renting for their whole lives. We know that, of course, with what's happened to property values, even if you have owned a home for decades and your relationship break down, you're really going to be hard up against it, both of you, to be able to buy back into the market. So there's 2 more people that are in the queue for a rental property.
I was actually pleased to see some of the government incentives for first home buyers, extending the definition of first home buyers to people who, not current homeowners, you know what I mean? So people in that situation that do need assistance, in the single family benefit and some of those benefits there. So that's interesting to see that sort of definition, I guess, extended. So, Michelle, I think I was trying to remember back to the first time we met. We met, I think, back in 2018. We interviewed you the first time, and we've had you back since then, of course. And even when we had you on the podcast, it was like, oh, this is a podcast for property investors. This is a property, podcast for people who own property, and it's a bit of a long bow having a conversation with somebody in community housing. But it is quite incredible to see how the conversation has changed, particularly this year. Really, it's very recent. Now, your Tasmanian appointment, which is the end of last year, that's come about since we last spoke. And before we go more nationally in this discussion, do you want to fill us in on the situation there?
Sure. In many ways, the demand and the issues are as we see, elsewhere on the mainland. I need to also preface this: I'm not officially the spokesperson for Homes Tasmania, so I will do my job as chair and speak broadly. But the needs are just as acute. We're talking variations in severity or in vacancy rates. We're not talking a substantially different market, with one exception, perhaps. The impact of short stay accommodation hit Hobart as a city, as a destination, earlier than it hit most other places. So that is a trend, and in fact, some of the first really good research around the impact of short stay accommodation on the long-term rental market was in fact done in Tasmania. So that's a substantial piece of work in the last 12 months that is very helpful in how do we sustain tourist-based economies while understanding and mitigating the impact on the loss of permanent housing. So that's an implication. The Tasmanian government is really to be congratulated. During the course of last year, when they established the Homes Tasmania Act, they recognised, unlike most of the mainland states, that have said we need to invest more in housing and we may need to amend some of our residential tenancies laws and provisions and the like. The Tasmanian government did that, but they also said we really need to reframe and rethink how we go about the whole housing system. And so the Homes Tasmania Act is established within that context. There is an overt expectation from the Act that we, as an organisation, statutory authority, that we not only ensure that we are providing housing to people at the really low income end, so that crisis accommodation, homelessness, social housing spectrum, but that we also provide recommendations and work across the rest of the housing system very explicitly to ensure that the housing needs of Tasmanians and of the economy are met through a sustainable, viable, diverse housing system. So it really is landmark legislation and a really innovative approach. The state's first housing strategy is about to go to cabinet. It's been really extensively, consulted and worked on over about 12 months now, maybe even a little longer, and it has a very bold and a very exciting ambition about the provision of housing for the state. So I'm really proud and really excited about the work we're going to be able to do there.
Great. And the irony is it's the only non-lefty government in the country. So there you go.
Yeah, and I think actually on that, many years ago, wearing a very different hat, I did a comparative analysis, little small things, on the New Zealand and Australian approaches to defence and to health, just a small little consultancy gig that I had for a while. And what I learnt from that is that in a smaller economy, in a smaller jurisdiction, which is New Zealand compared to Australia, problems, challenges, things hit harder, they bite harder, more quickly. And therefore, those jurisdictions are almost required to be more nimble, more strategic, to be more courageous. And I see very, very similar parallels with what we are doing in Tasmania compared to the mainland on housing.
Really interesting. Now, the short-term rental impact, it's something that we've sort of skirted around the edges here. We have mentioned it a number of times, but we haven't had any hard data to sort of talk to other than anecdotally. And we can see that it's certainly impacted regional areas, probably more than our capitals, but other than Hobart, of course, which is a capital. But what is the real reality of the impact? Are you able to talk to that for a moment?
Look, I don't have the hard numbers in front of me, but certainly that report I mentioned earlier does have hard numbers. We have seen, and of course housing, as we have discussed before, is a very complex environment. It is very significantly impacted by our tax treatments and investment treatments, and we are seeing, particularly from the federal government, appropriately, some thinking or not around some of those tax provisions. But what we have seen is that, if I own a second or a third property, it is a reality. I can get much higher income return from that property by letting it for short stay accommodation than what I can get by letting it for a full-time rental. So that's kind of the fundamental problem. Now, if all we're thinking about is an individual's right, as indeed I would support, to manage their property as best they see fit, that's appropriate and it's one perspective. But we also need to think about, are people playing by the same rules? So the hotel industry and motel association have said for decades, hang on a minute, we've got to have fire doors. Hang on a minute, we've got to have minimum standards. Hang on a minute, how come those rules don't apply if this is otherwise a personal dwelling? So that's been a factor for a long time. We know that if local government areas are not inclined to approve DAs for serviced apartments, for new hotels, for guest houses and things, well, how is the economy of that tourist community going to continue to thrive and grow and prosper? So, like all things, it's not an either or. We have to plan for these things with a really respectful, open, and collegiate community view and focus that allows time for transition, but doesn't shy away from the evidence of some hard, difficult facts. I mean, one of the wonderful opportunities to reform the tax legislation that I think is really interesting, but I might be one of the only people that's brave enough to say it out loud, is, if a property is, for argument's sake, only leased for, say, 4 months of the year, 4 months out of 12, why don't we only allow 4/12 of the tax deductibility? And why don't we only allow you to write off 4/12 of your rates and 4/12 of your interest and 4/12 of, because that's the only time that asset is generating an income for you. So, I think now is the time for us to have some more courageous, creative conversations about the impact of short stay housing. But as I say, very critically, with great empathy for the communities that rely on it.
It's a hard one, right? Because they put all these mandates on, short-term lettings to say you can only have 180 days, right? And it's almost like you're sort of restricting it, but it's, potentially they'd be better off to have 2 short-term lettings doing 365 days than 2 doing 180 days, right? So it's sort of, it's sort of counterintuitive sometimes, those policies. I think you're right. It's a catch-22. Airbnb is amazing to use, right? But there's a social issue it's sort of like it's potentially we've got to work with it, but it's how do we integrate it into our communities at a sustainable level? And do you think that what Victoria's doing? I mean, I think they're potentially just going to charge a minimal fee. I think it's only a few $100s and potentially a record keeping of them, but there's nothing stopping it, I guess. What's your take on it?
Look, I think it's one of those situations where we'll benefit if we have multiple initiatives and pilot programs that are properly evaluated and thoroughly understood for specific periods of time. And, in that they need to be for long enough. We know that some destinations with short stay platforms are very seasonal. So, if we just do something and we only have a look at the summer months in a coastal town, it's going to be an entirely different evidence base to if we have a look at it over a couple of seasons where we've got, really lousy wet winters and we've got, road closures because of, God forbid, another bushfire, or we've got something, So we've got to take a really strong evidence base. And again, in Australia, we have the ability to be able to look at a number of jurisdictions overseas and see how they're managing it. We don't have to pretend that we're coming up with new solutions. If there's one thing I continue to be very frustrated by, it's the expectation that governments have of, let's be innovative. No, can we just do what we know works? Like, seriously? It's not always a good idea to chase new and shiny. Sometimes, it's that stuff around. Don't let the best be the enemy of the good, and don't pretend that we have to invent everything new for the first time.
Is your thoughts aligned to the $10 billion Housing Australia Future Fund or whatever it's called? Those sort of initiatives, what's your thoughts on that? Like, do you think that they're just trying to buy votes and show that they're spending some money, but they're not going to the community and say what's actually going to get results? It's more about a number that gets airtime rather than what we actually need.
Well, let's unpack that a little bit and make sure that we're talking in real terms as best we can at this stage. We have a need in Australia today for about 640,000 homes. At its best, the Housing Australia Future Fund, the HAF, might deliver about 40,000. We are talking about investing $10 billion and only using the interest that is earned from that investment. As yet, the legislation does not guarantee a minimum of $500 million, which is the number that's often spoken about. If the investment return for the $10 billion only delivers $200 million 1 year, that's all that will flow. No developer, whether they're a not-for-profit community housing provider like the Housing Trust or a private property developer, private industry, government, not-for-profits, we've all got to be a part of this solution. And some of the very good thinking and some of the very good work around the Accord and around the principles on which Housing Australia, which is the overarching kind of body, is going to be established very collaboratively and really beaut. And we've seen some very good initiatives and collaboration and national cabinets and think tanks around that stuff. So the government's really to be congratulated about that, and so too are all the states and territories who have come to those conversations in a very open and collaborative frame. But as yet, there's no guarantee that how much money we will have. You can't build a pipeline. The biggest thing that property developers, the housing industry needs is certainty. We have none about the minimum. The current legislation also says once it hits $500 million in return, it turns off. So if those investments actually deliver $800 million, we're not going to get it. So what's the point of that?
Although you could argue that they need to preserve the capital in the fund, and obviously $10 billion, if it stays at the same amount, is going to go down in value over time. And
in fact, there's no guarantee yet that that $10 billion is going to be topped up with CPI either.
And I mean, look, it's interesting actually because there's a national housing and homelessness plan that is in the process of being developed, and that's just one element of it. The Greens have had a lot of airplay by trying to stall that particular piece of legislation that we were just discussing, and I mean, looking outside, looking in, I feel that's disruptive, to be quite honest, but you may agree with them, I don't know. We will ask you that in a moment. But also as part of that, the federal government recently revealed its ambitious plans to build 1.2 million dwellings over 5 years, which is only 200,000 more than the previous target anyway. So once again, it's like, let's understand the numbers. You said we need 600,000 now, so that's not even going to do the job. But even that is ambitious. So do you think that's achievable? And what do you think about the National Housing and Homelessness Plan as it's unfolding?
Well, 1.2 million homes is a stretch of somewhere, depending on the state, of somewhere between an additional 20 and 35% capacity.
It's a lot.
It's arguably unrealistic on a national level. Might a couple of the states and territories be able to get where they need to go? Maybe. Can we do it nationally? I think it's entirely unlikely. I do believe in targets. They are necessary. We have seen the benefit of that in Tasmania around what it takes to be able to, really focus everybody's attention and to think differently. So targets are a really good idea. I'm all for stretch targets. But I think at this point, even the private industry is saying the likelihood of being able to achieve that number is really very low. There is also a growing opinion around the fact that if we're not careful about how we invest, we may supercharge part of the industry in a way that has unintended negative consequences, as indeed we saw with HomeBuilder, where all it did was push prices up. It became more inflationary. So the focus has got to be, how do we increase the supply of social and affordable rental housing? It is a sub-market product. It must have, there is no choice. There must be government contributions. All three levels of government, as again we've discussed before, have a role to play. But a sub-market product, a subsidised product, needs a subsidy. It's got to be very deliberate and very thoughtful. If all we do is build, another million market houses, we've never had more supply than we've had in the last 10 years, and it's never been less affordable. Supply alone will not fix this problem.
That's a very good point. I just want to go back to when we first met. I remember you talking about the Waterloo redevelopment, and you said you were, and I can't remember the exact numbers, you basically said there was something like only an extra 9 dwellings for was that the exact number? For low income people in need, basically. Now, Min's government has just come out recently saying that they've suddenly recognised that that wasn't enough, and that they've actually increased the proportion of, and I may have the terminology wrong, so do forgive me, of low income housing as part of the mix in that redevelopment. Do you take that seriously? Is it a genuine and real change? do you think?
Simply yes. I think the New South Wales government is very genuine. I think there is very real recognition not only of the problem and the challenges, but also of the benefits of increasing the supply of social and affordable housing. I'm not hearing yet an appetite for mandating inclusionary zoning, which is simplistically of a medium to higher density project. So the numbers economically start to kick in at a villa or a small apartment block or a townhouse development of round about 15 to 18 dwellings. At that point, what we should be mandating, in my view, is a minimum of 30% affordable rental housing in every one of those developments. Some of that we're starting to see in the incentives that the New South Wales government is looking at formalising in the planning approvals process, where you'll get some fast track approval as well as additional height or density if you include some affordable housing. Two risks and problems with that. The first is that unless the government mandates that the affordable supply is contracted through a regulated community housing provider, they will have no compliance, they will have no visibility, there will be no guarantee that the stock is actually managed for affordable rental. There's a very robust regulatory framework available, so the government, in my view, would be crazy not to require that. We are already seeing a lot of shelf company tokenistic, I'm a community housing provider kind of scams, for want of a better word, that are starting to come into play.
Of course.
So the government needs to be able to leverage a really sophisticated, robust existing regulatory framework to support their ambitions, which I do believe are very genuine. And the other risk with that legislation is, how do we stop a private developer getting their DA fast-tracked approved and getting the uplift, and then land banking it, not doing anything with it?
Yeah.
We need to, and I don't know, that's a really tricky subject, but we need to be able to find a way of guaranteeing that supply actually happens as quickly as possible. And that's from a construction perspective, not just from a DA approval perspective.
I'm on a personal mission to help more people make better property decisions. And you can find out all about what I'm working on at veronicamorgan.com.au. And there you'll find resources for first home buyers, details about my buyer's agent mentoring program, access to suburb help for investors, or if you're looking to buy your dream home or an investment property in Sydney's inner west, eastern suburbs or lower North Shore, you can connect with my team at Good Deeds Property Buyers.
If you're thinking about buying your first home, upgrading to a new one, or purchasing an investment property anywhere in Australia, we would love to carefully guide you through this journey and importantly get the finance right. Please reach out via our website, wealthful.com.au.
Don't forget that you can download our free full or forecaster report. Which experts can you trust to get it right? theelephantintheroom.com.au.
Michelle, is there any sort of really low-hanging fruits? Like Scott Keck, we spoke about this on the podcast before, came up with a innovative solution where basically you rent out a room, you wouldn't be subject to any income tax on that, and potentially wouldn't affect your capital gains tax-free exemption if it was in your home, and that would encourage potentially people to rent out rooms or rent out their granny flat, or look at and then that would help them with their mortgage and things like that. And I think that's a really good option if there was like a moratorium and things like that on that. But is there anything in your mind where, you've got 600,000 people, probably a lot of those don't know where to sleep tonight. And, there's great, we can build more supply and all that, but this is years down the line. What sort of things can they sort of hold on to say, like, if we can work on these things, we'll get solutions in 2023, not 2030?
I think the only options there, Chris, are buildings that already exist or buildings that are nearing completion. There are some options for repurposing existing buildings, and we can do that. Sometimes it might be, we've seen quite a bit of that sort of stuff in repurposing uni accommodation or nurses' quarters or motels, the rooms above, some of our lovely old big pubs, some of that stuff. So there might be some repurposing options. They can be expensive, but not as expensive and as, a whole new build, and certainly a much faster conversion often. That's an option. There are some interesting ideas around converting roof spaces, either flat roof spaces, and maybe putting some sort of modular style, quick, easy build housing, or even if it's just one or two apartments on top of an existing building, assuming it's structurally sound and all those sort of stuff. Or
penthouse.
Yeah. Like seriously, modifying a roof space to convert or create an attic, which then becomes, so that's an option. And then, of course, there are incentives, or there is the opportunity, the mechanism, the need for us to be able to grab some of the apartments that are or townhouses or anything else that are nearing completion and say, please do not try and sell these. More importantly, please don't let them sit empty. Here's a government-supported incentive program to make those dwellings available for 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, longer, if possible, for affordable rental. And that's the only way, because if we all know, unfortunately, just about everywhere, if we say, okay, tick, here's a block of land, go build something, we've got a year or two in planning and approvals, we've then got another 2 years. So the only way that we can get some quick wins is if we've got a structure that is quickly, easily converted or is nearing completion.
Do we have a better handle on all the vacant properties in the country? And I'm sure we've discussed this before, or I've discussed it with someone, about, there's something like 1 million dwellings that are vacant. So out of 11 million, do we know what they are, like the makeup of them, and how to incentivize or disincentivize people from leaving them empty, perhaps? I'm sure some of them are uninhabitable.
I'm probably more concerned that the majority of them are actually relatively habitable is the bigger problem. You often see buildings, construction finishes, and the lights just never turn on because somebody's just sitting with them. They've decided they can hold them, which is extraordinary when you think about the cost of financial investment. But look, it varies. Some states, again, Victoria, did some pretty good work to try and understand at least metropolitan Melbourne vacancies and where they were at. But we don't really know. We don't have sufficient information. And of course, the data comes, and that 1 million homes comes from the last census.
Yeah.
And they were vacant on that night. We don't know what happened the following weekend, or when the people came back from overseas, or when, so there's a whole range of things that are a little bit less certain.
It's funny you mentioned that, Veronica, because there's some data that came out last week that is electricity usage. I think it might have been the last couple of weeks ago. And it was like 1.3% of homes didn't have any recent electricity usage, right? So that's like, and that goes, like we say, census is 10%, but then 1% is recent electricity usage. That's maybe more realistic. It's nowhere near this 1 million homes that isn't getting used at all. And maybe that's maybe they're only getting part used. Maybe it's a weekend rental. So yeah, maybe it's only at 20% capacity or 5% capacity, but it doesn't seem to be anywhere near as high as what you'd probably those previous estimates would be. Is that have you sort of heard, is that your sort of take as well, Michelle?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's my point about, on that census night, the property was empty. But I really think that that's a very substantial and a critically important piece of work that should happen. And it needs to be very localized, because again, even if I just think about my work here across the Illawarra, which is of course just an hour from southern Sydney and then down into the Shoalhaven, there is an enormous difference between the north end of the Wollongong Council area, say Thirroul, Austinmere, Coaldale, where there are lots of weekenders that might be vacant there. Is a very different scenario to why might something be vacant in Shoalhaven Heads or East Nowra or Kiama, or there are differences.
Now, obviously, all these sort of plans and incentives and programs and funding, et cetera, is going to take years to trickle down and really make any meaningful difference, to helping those in dire need, but also just generally in terms of the rental crisis in this country. At a more sort of micro level, what options are currently open to people who can't afford can't find affordable housing? I mean, are families still living in tents? Are they still living in caravans?
More than what there were a month ago. But, it's interesting, actually, just before we come to that, you just said something really interesting and that I think is really important. You just use the words trickle down. That's one of the fundamental problems with
trickle
policy.
Down economics.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
It simply doesn't work that way. And that's why I said before, we aren't talking about a sub-market product. If anybody could make money out of providing social housing, otherwise, public housing, government housing, if anybody could make money out of that stuff, well, they would have been. They can't, right? That's why we now only have about 4% of housing stock in Australia is social housing for people on very low to low incomes. It should be somewhere between 10 and 15% of our total housing stock. That's the gap, right? So there is no way in the world that building more stuff is going to somehow make that housing miraculously appear. It's not going to happen. That's the role of government policy and of programs and of government investment. And so, we've got to do that. So sorry, before I answer your question about the range, but it's really important.
Before you do answer the question as well, just on that, in a way, I guess, it's like a lot of people have said, the build to rent, that's going to solve the problem, right? And in a way, that will take a certain segment of the market out. Those people potentially might be renting something less than they could afford if there was other stock available, potentially. So maybe in that sense, there is downward pressure because people who can't find accommodation, they will look for lesser standard accommodation they can afford to pay for it, right? So that ultimately pushes people out. And then if you've got the short-term accommodation issue too, with, Chris's point there is very interesting about, it's been, I might have a house that used to have a low income tenant, but I booted them out. I did a cheap and cheerful tart up. It's in a seaside location and now I put it on the market, but I can only have it rented for 180 days a year. And so exactly that takes out another property for the whole time, like it's sitting there empty when people have nowhere to live. So that has all displaced the most vulnerable in our society, right? So you said that there's more people living in tents than there were before. So even though these other initiatives that are in the commercial space that developers and builders and et cetera can make money from, don't directly help those who are on low income, surely they would take the pressure off that lower segment of the market. Is that fair observation or not?
Not really. Not
okay,
really.
Good.
Not
off
not off the low end of the market, right? Build to rent, and I love it when private developers, we've got this new product called build to rent. My organisation's just celebrated 40 years of doing build to rent. That's what community housing providers do. We build to hold. We always have. We've been doing it conservatively for 40 to 50 years, right? So there's reason number one why I love the word innovation, but we know that build to rent is a really important part of the market. We simply have never had enough of that in Australia. That's absolutely true. And again, relative to jurisdictions internationally, we've got a really big missing piece of the puzzle there. But it is typically a premium product. The reason it needs to be a premium product is they're still really expensive. Building apartments typically in Australia is still a really, really expensive proposition to be able to, fund, particularly with interest rates and property developers and builders have been hit with those interest rate rises, just like me and our industry and everybody else.
But it's one of the problems also with forcing councils in more affluent suburbs to make development sites available, because it's land costs more in some suburbs than it does in other suburbs. So it's like slightly naive. But anyway, on that.
But interestingly too, and I mentioned my commitment and my desire for us to see inclusionary zoning. I that absolutely needs a long lead time. So a developer buying a block of land today, in an affluent suburb or not, they are doing their feasibility and they will pay an amount of money based on what they think and when they think they can bring that product to market, how much, how long that's going to take and what they're going to be able to get for it as a result. So if we bring in something like inclusionary zoning, we must stage it and we must give people a long enough lead time. So if we said as a country, in 5 years, 5% of every development with more than 16 dwellings, so 1 out of 16's got to be for affordable rental, and we allow people to make their feasibility planning, land banking, purchase decisions based on knowing that's going to come in 5 years, find a way, it'll happen, right? This is a very sophisticated, a very capable industry, and I believe, our colleagues have got more than enough nous to be able to make that work. It happens everywhere overseas, so there's no reason to think that Australian property developers aren't at least as smart and aren't at least as good as their European and North American colleagues. And then we say in 10 years it's got to be a bigger number, and in 20 years it's got to be bigger still, right? But in the short term, I do think it's completely appropriate to incentivise the private industry, whether it's a waiving in fees, whether it's a higher density or a bonuses. As I said before, though, as long as those things are safeguarded and that the homes that are produced are indeed used for and provided for within the context in which those approvals were given.
Michelle, we've had Jeremy McLeod from Breathe Architects. We've had Chris from Assemble Communities on years ago. Like Nightingale Housing, we're going to get them on it. We are. So, they have seemed to have some amazing success. Nightingale win, pretty much every development award for new projects. They just are, and they've got 12 projects on it. They've got 10,000 people on their waiting list, etc. So, do you think that we've got some great case studies where density's done well, and it also can be done cheaper if certain things are avoided, right? Which there's parking or there's lots of things they do. Do you think we should be using them as almost our guinea pigs to expand it out and getting access to super money? That's what Assemble sort of figured out, is that the superannuation funds that have trillions of dollars now, that it actually makes sense to have a bit of exposure to residential real estate with long-term tenants when you've got people going to retirement who need steady income. So is that a solution that doesn't get enough airtime and should be pushed up the list?
Gosh, you've just said about 10 really interesting, important things. Let me see if I can knock some of them off. Should superannuation capital be invested in the provision of social and affordable housing? Yes. For that to happen, it is actually a little bit more complex than what you might imagine. Part of the solution is to have our industry, our product, formally recognised as social infrastructure. Not as residential housing. It changes the risk profile. That is absolutely consistent with Infrastructure Australia, which is the government body that says, in fact, one of their top priorities to the government is invest in social and affordable housing. It's right up there with roads and hospitals and schools and, IT systems and stuff. So that's a driver. The other thing, of course, quite rightly, as members, we want our super to be safe and to be secure. That's why recognising social and affordable housing as social infrastructure is a really good, sensible enabler, because we don't have anywhere near the sort of fluctuations. It's a very low risk profile, so that's possible. Most superannuation funds are only investing for 10 years. Maybe 15. It's not long enough. This needs to be for at least 25 to 40 years, as indeed you would with other infrastructure. So that's really important. And again, it changes their expectations and the way they need to go around delivering returns. It's why the previous federal government, when they introduced NIFIC and the social investment bonds that were then directed into the supply of social and affordable housing, was such a fabulous enabler. And we got billions of dollars of investment because it was backed by government guarantee. It was safe, and it was really always oversubscribed, actually, those government bonds. So they were great. So we should do more of that. There's no reason in the world why states and territories couldn't be looking at those sorts of options too. And indeed, the ESG agenda is driving superannuation funds to look at that too. So that all makes really good sense. Some of the other stuff that you mentioned around the product mix and the type, density, yes, of course we should have density. We're all talking about the missing middle. We all know that a 3-story walk up is awesome when you're in your 20s, maybe in your 30s by the time you've got a stroller, or you've had your knee replacement. Not a great option, but we all know that that's a really good thing to do. And so yes, we should have more 3-stories. My colleagues at City West Housing in Sydney won a Land and Environment Court decision, which is fabulous, to reduce the amount of private individual parking that was required in one of their projects that's very well located for bus and train transport by replacing private vehicle spaces with go-get spaces. What an obvious, amazing thing to do.
Innovation.
Indeed. One might say common sense. But, you know, I'm trying to do that in one of our big projects in Dapto. I think the ratio, I think it was something like 7-1. So they replaced 7 spaces with 1. I mean, that's amazing. So, you know, there's some cool stuff like that. But again, you know, Nightingale, great idea, really hard to roll out at scale, really hard. It's like tiny homes. It's like, you know, you mentioned earlier, Chris, the idea of renting your bedroom. We've been doing that for decades. Like, didn't everybody have a flatmate at some stage? Like, again, that's not really rocket science, but nor does it work, you know, for everybody on every occasion. Indeed, it's also not appropriate to have an expectation that an older person or an older couple is going to be, you know, somehow made to feel guilty because they're still living in their 4-bedroom home because somebody somewhere else has decided that it would be more appropriate for a family to live there. Well, who are you to decide how and where somebody else's mum and dad or grandparents, you know, grow old? That's just not okay. We mustn't demonize individuals because of you know, decades of policy failure.
Michelle, can you finish this up with a property Dumbo? Obviously, there's a very serious conversation, so it's nice to finish on hopefully more humorous lights.
My Dumbo at the moment is, I think there's really great work being done in New South Wales to have a look at how do we optimise land around transport hubs and transport links. And I think that's really sensible and a really good idea. We've got to make sure that the bureaucracy doesn't get in the way. Heard a really funny thing, which is kind of funny, sad. I was in a private industry meeting the other day, and they said they wrote to 9 ministers, all with immediate direct influence around issues of housing and residential housing supply. So, you know, read everything from the housing minister, the planning minister, infrastructure to small business to this, to that, to everything else. 7 of the 9 ministers sent the letter to somebody else and said, not my problem. Housing is everybody's problem. And so we need not just the housing and the planning minister coming to the table, but we need infrastructure, and we need transport, and we need health, and we need everybody coming to the table and saying, okay, this is our problem. So it's our solution to find.
I was actually watching a really I forget the name of the title, but I actually paid $6 on Fetch to watch this. It's about an old chap, and it's back in the 1930s, and basically, yeah, he's starting to work in a government office, and someone comes about it. It was a problem around, I think it was housing, and they just literally went up the stairs, and they went to another office and said, it's not my problem, and then went downstairs to another room and said, it's not my problem, and it's all the areas of government just blaming each other. And it's funny, that was probably 100 years ago when that was, you know, trying to recreate, and it's still what we do today. So
yeah, well, it might also be a reason why I don't watch Utopia. I got enough shovel-ready options. I don't need anybody else telling me that they're a good idea.
Thanks so much for coming on, Michelle.
Thank you both so much.
If you have a question that you'd like us to answer in an upcoming Q&A episode, you can send us a voicemail or written question via the website, theelephantintheroom.com.au, or you can email us directly at questions@theelephantintheroom.com.au. If you like what you're hearing, please share this episode with others you feel would benefit. And while you're at it, why not leave us an iTunes review? 5 stars would be great. I know that sounds a bit cringy, but we have it on good authority that every review helps make it easier for other people to find out about us and hear what our